Welcome back, scholars, to American literature. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this stunning creature here is Miss Edith Wharton. She is our author today, the author of Roman Fever. And let me tell you, next to the story Chickamauga, this is going to be the most violent story you read all semester. Now, let me give you a bit of a caveat with that. It's violent in a different way. It's violent in, well, it's drawing room violence as opposed to physical violence. And in some respects, as you will see at the end of the story, which reads almost like a really impressive prize fight if you look very closely, ends with a knockout punch, a rope-a-dope, so brutal, so final that it leaves the second combatant flat on the mat with no chance of getting up again. But anyway, about Miss Wharton here. Edith Wharton was born in 1862 near Washington Square, New York. She wrote about New York society for the most part, and she wrote about the same things that her friend Henry James did. She first published poems anonymously in the Atlantic Monthly in 1880. Her most famous and influential work was the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Age of Innocence, which was released in 1920. Now, Roman Fever, as I said, the most brutal story you're going to read. Most violent next to Chickamauga, of course. The scene opens with a couple of wealthy widows, wealthy American ladies on vacation with their daughters in Rome. They are the daughters are likely teenagers and enjoying their first taste of freedom, just as the two ladies did when they were girls. Now, these folks, they've been frenemies all their lives, well, pretty much all their lives. In fact, they were frenemies before the term frenemy became popular. Mrs. Ansley and Mrs. Slade, old friends, they've been vacationing here since they were their daughter's ages. Miss Slade, from Miss Slade's internal monologue, you get a picture that these two women, they enjoy I guess we could call it a polite antipathy, right? A kind aggression toward each other. Most of it is so quiet, though. It's kept internally. Mrs. Slade is all about status. Now, Mrs. Slade is also kind of like your stereotypical mean girl who has grown up into being a mean woman and now a mean spinster widow. Although the term spinster doesn't really apply because she was, in fact, married. Mrs. Slade is all about status and place. They were both widows, and Mrs. Slade, from her statement on page 71, feels like she is the better mother, having little to do with any regard to raising her own daughter. She can't figure out why Jenny is so sharp, has such an edge, given who her parents were, namely her friend Mrs. Ansley and her husband, who she just kind of, Mrs. Ansley's husband, who she always kind of thought of as dull. Now, I read a book on martial arts years and years back, and the guy writing the book said something kind of interesting. He said, animals who don't possess lethal weapons fight more cruelly and violently than those who do, right? Snakes will attack and battle each other without venom. Wolves will fight for dominance without tearing each other's throats out. Human beings are incredibly cruel. We don't have teeth or fangs. We don't have venom. We don't have spines like the manta ray. They can skewer or poison our prey. So, given that we can't kill easily, we tend to fight dirtier, meaner, nastier. And such is the case here with Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Ansley. Right? Mrs. Ansley is the quieter of the two. We learned that she, in spite of being quiet, she holds Mrs. Slade in somewhat low regard herself, although she is much more pitying of her. Brilliant line on page 781. It gives you a sense of how close and yet how so far apart these two ladies are. She says, so these two ladies visualized each other from the wrong end of their, each of these ladies visualized the other from the wrong end of her telescope. And you know that image is perfect because looking through the wrong end of a telescope, everything looks so small. They underestimated each other. Roman fever, which the story draws its title, is actually malaria. Malaria is Italian or even Latin for bad air. As from malcontent or maladjusted area air. There was an outbreak of Roman fever in 50 A.D. and it returned repeatedly from 50 to 70 A.D. It actually was spread by mosquitoes. People didn't understand what it was back then, given the limited medical knowledge at the time. Then they just thought, okay, there's something in the air that's making people sick. It's bad air. Roman fever here serves as a kind of cautionary role, as a sort of biological boogeyman, as it were. The mothers warning their daughters to stay in after dark lest you catch Roman fever. It was a form of behavioral modification, kind of the biological boogeyman, keeping them out of trouble. Right? Mrs. Slade's jealousy is projected on her daughter. She surmises that Miss Ansley lets their daughters hang out because her own daughter is the Duff, if you know the term. There's a teenage rom-com called The Duff years ago. Duff standing for Designated Ugly Fat Friend. Very politically incorrect, but that's the equivalent here. She thinks, that she just lets her hang out with her because she's prettier or she's more charming or whatever, and she just kind of like the moon reflects the light of the sun. She just stays close to her because of how it benefits her. Mrs. Slade finally gives her voice to her jealousy and her indignation here. She actually goes so far as to question how such dull people produce such a child as Barbara. Right? Mrs. Slade expresses disappointment in her own daughter, saying she's not brilliant, but she's an angel. Why is this a bad thing, right? Yeah, you would think that this would be great. She's not. She's not sharp, she's not witty, but she's an angel. She's such a good person. And isn't that unfortunate? Right? Mrs. Slade is at least aware of her jealousy, but Miss Ansley, Mrs. Slade is at least aware of her jealousy of Miss Ansley, which might also be her saving grace. Mrs. Ansley is in The Wicked Aunt, that story there. This is cool here. It's a symbolic story and within the context of Roman fever. Mrs. Slade reminds Miss Ansley of the story she told about her wicked aunt who sent her sister out into the night to gather wildflowers to press into a book out of jealousy. And as a result, her sister caught Roman fever and died. And the reason she sent her out because she had challenged her for the affections of a suitor. And so this was the wicked aunt's way of getting her out of the way. The story here begins to kind of unfold. Mrs. Ansley tells her that she was jealous in those days because she was happy. Because Mrs. Slade was happy. She was engaged to Delphin and worried that Mrs. Ansley would steal him away. And that's what she's essentially really saying. Right? Mrs. Ansley went out late one night to the Coliseum and slipped in past the lock gate, as lovers do. It was a place you could slip off and be alone. Yes, folks, unfortunately, slipping off to some dark location to park or to have a romantic time with the one you love has been going on for as long as there have been men and women. Mrs. Ansley presses Mrs. Slade and she confesses. She confesses that she knows that Mrs. Ansley went to the Coliseum and to meet Delphin because she wrote a fake letter. Now remember that Mrs. Ansley, not long after, contracted Roman fever and had to go away and convalesce somewhere else for a time, for a season. When she came back, she was quickly married to her husband, and then had a daughter not long after, and their life began, and they, of course, had looked at each other from across the streets jealously. Oh, she's got new curtains. Well, it's time for us to get new curtains, and so on and so forth. And so they had, for years, this sort of aggressive, unpleasant kind of friendship, but maintained a patina of gentility and pleasantness because they were friends. Right. So she confesses that she knows Mrs. Ansley went out to the Coliseum to meet Delphin because she wrote a fake letter to lure her there. She was hoping that Mrs. Ansley would go and get sick, just like in the story of the wicked ant, and she wanted her out of the way, right, to protect her so that she wouldn't steal Delphin away from her. So Mrs. Slade presses her attack rather, and when Miss Ansley weeps openly about the letter being the only one that she had from Delphin, that it was a fake, Mrs. Slade feels as though she has triumphed, feels like she's won, right? She's got you. Well, Mrs. Ansley is crushed by the news, having clung to this memory for so long. And Mrs. Slade then is a bit surprised, and she kind of feels bad, right? You ever win and you think, I won? Dang it, why doesn't this feel better? This is what's going on with her. She's guilt-ridden over his victory. It says Mrs. Ansley did get sick, and she was married off to Horace Ansley months afterward. Mrs. Slade tries to dismiss it as a joke and that she waited around to be let in, and she felt bad when her rival got sick. She said, "Oh, you must have waited around there in the Coliseum gates and to be let in, and you just must have got sick out there from exposure." And he said, "Well, I'm sorry you got sick. I feel bad about that." And at this point, Mrs. Ansley's kind of been on the ropes the whole time, taking just blow after blow after blow from Mrs. Slade. She explains that Delphin actually kept the appointment. Actually, when I got the letter, I wrote back, and Delphin came and met me, and we had sexy time at the Coliseum. And yeah, Mrs. Slade recovers a bit. This actually is Mrs. Ansley, who has been this sort of meek figure, and this turns and like a lion responds to Mrs. Slade's attack, and she says, Mrs. Slade kind of recovers some of her dignity and launches a counterattack and says, "Well, I had all those years, and you had one night and the letter that I wrote." And just as it seems that Mrs. Slade is recovering here and is about to triumph, Mrs. Ansley comes back with an uppercut that floors her. She says, Mrs. Ansley drops back almost in a fighting stance, delivers the knockout blow with, "I have Barbara." Yes, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you following along at home, the score is Mrs. Ansley by total knockout. Okay? She emerges the victor by total KO because here's what happened. Mrs. Slade did herself in by her own scheming. Right? Much like the malevolent ant. Well, unlike the malevolent ant, she winds up losing in the end. Because here's the thing. She tried to set her frenemy up, who, by all evidence in the text, maybe wasn't such a bad person. In fact, wasn't a bad person at all. She was actually perhaps genuine in her friendship as much as she could be to Mrs. Slade. But Mrs. Slade, the frenemy, the mean girl here, we call her Karen today, thought she could worm her way around this and get her rival out of the way, only to find out that, in fact, what happened was she wound up creating the very situation she was terrified of. Now, what do we take away from this? Roman fever. Roman fever is a metaphor of sorts in polite society. Excuse me. Language. It's polite society language for getting in a family way. Oh, she has Roman fever. We're going to spirit her away to convalesce over in this other place, and quickly marry her off to Mr. Ansley, so that her shame of getting pregnant out of wedlock, which was very scandalous back in these days, to a much lesser degree today, but back then it was the height of social embarrassment. You become something of a pariah. So her mother quickly married her off to Mr. Ansley to cover her sin. Right? You might call it an immaculate conception or an 8-month pregnancy. Who is the monster here? Who do we look to? Is it Mrs. Slade, who has been just so unjustly cruel to Mrs. Antley, just needling her, or is it Mrs. Antley herself? My money is on Mrs. Slade. You may differ. You may have a different take on that. Jealousy. Jealousy here is a destructive force. Edith Wharton here is telling us a great and powerful lesson about the nature of jealousy and how it can rend you. Also, the timid can be mighty. Dear, sweet Mrs. Antley, who sits there with her knitting needles and just quietly knitting away as Mrs. Slade is saying all these really politely terrible things to her. And you know, this story could just as easily happen today, right? You can see this as an episode of Jerry Springer. A lot less dignified, of course, and a lot less polite, but it could happen. All right, so that is Edith Wharton's fantastic, brutal story, Roman Fever. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll see you in the next video.